My name is Natasha Coutts, and I am the Africa Programs Manager for the Jane Goodall Institute Australia.
Episode 4, Projects in Africa.
I oversee the implementation, development, and review of the various projects that JGIA is involved with in Africa.
The Jane Goodall Institute in Australia is made up of a very small yet passionately active team. Natasha, an integral part of that team, leads the Africa programs for JGIA. At the time of recording this interview, Natasha was in the midst of working on her PhD thesis, a labour of love driven by a desire to conserve the chimpanzees of Africa. We begin Natasha's story as she explains how she became involved with JGIA.
I have been with the organisation for a long time. I started off with JGIA as a volunteer in, I want to say 2013, I think it was, 2013, 2014. I had just started my undergraduate degree in biology, but I had the goal of working with primates at some point in some capacity. So I wasn't sure how I was going to do it, but that was why I was going to uni and studying biology. As soon as you get to uni, as I'm sure most students now will be able to relate to, they drum into you how important it is to try and get experience on the books. So, go out there and hustle and try and get any kind of volunteer work that you can to build up your experience, because it's really competitive. Everyone wants to work with animals. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people want to work with animals. Kind of the dream job. Knowing that I wanted to work with primates, there aren't too many opportunities in Australia bar zoos. I did some Googling and found JGI Australia, and they were relatively new at that point. So still a very fresh fledgling organisation. So I reached out and expressed interest in supporting in any way possible, and was upfront about my motivation for wanting to get involved, and they welcomed me with open arms in any capacity that I could bring. I started off volunteering on a couple of campaigns, so overseeing the development and management of the mobile phone recycling campaign. So that was about trying to mobilize people to recycle their old mobile phones to raise money to support chimpanzee and gorilla conservation projects run by the Jane Goodall Institute as a global organisation in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And then I was also working on the campaign around palm oil, and that was mainly an advocacy campaign. So that wasn't really trying to raise money for anything. It was more to get people aware of what palm oil is, where it comes from, and also expand the conversation beyond the problems that were being seen in Indonesia and Malaysia around the production of palm oil, to the fact that palm oil production was also expanding into Central Africa.
Small not-for-profit organisations don't often have many paid roles to offer. However, luckily for Natasha, the stars aligned and an opportunity became available.
I stayed volunteering doing that work for a couple of years, and then a paid position became available. That was offered to me, and that was National Coordinator for the Roots and Shoots program, which is JGI's youth environmental education program. I was in that paid position for about 18 months. During that period, I actually started my PhD. That was chimpanzee research in Rwanda. So I was going to be heading off to Rwanda imminently, and it would have been very difficult for me to manage the Roots and Shoots program, which is based around projects in Australia from Africa, and having a local team in Australia. So I was very lucky, and the organisation created my role, my current role, although it has evolved a lot since those early days, but essentially created my Africa programs role for me then, because it aligned more with my skill set and my interests and my sort of technical expertise. And 7 and a bit years later, here I am.
There has to be something really special about a species in order for somebody to dedicate their career and life to its conservation. I was curious about why chimpanzees had made such an impression on Natasha.
They're just really cool. um, but I think my little science brain gets particularly excited about social species with sort of higher levels of cognitive ability, and I guess the intersection of those two things. And then always been a bit of a nature nerd and liked being outdoors. So primates live in some pretty amazing places throughout the world. So if one is lucky enough to be a field biologist and go out and study a primate in their natural environment, you're not only observing really interesting, fascinating animals, but you're also doing it in really, really cool locations.
Africa is a long way away for somebody born and raised in Australia. Was Natasha's passion for African conservation a result of childhood travel or sparked some other way?
No, all National Geographic, all Discovery Channel, the zoo as well. Although I have a bit of a bittersweet relationship with zoos, I can definitely appreciate and recognize their role. But as someone who spends time with animals in their natural habitats, it always pulls on the heartstrings a little bit to see them in captivity, even when the captive conditions are quite nice and they look happy and comfortable and content. It's still very few captive environments will ever be the same as a natural environment. A little bit of bittersweetness there. But not knocking zoos. We work in collaboration with a lot of zoos, and zoos definitely have a major role in conservation. That's just sort of like a personal feeling that I have. But no, as a child, I never had the privilege of going out and hanging out with primates. My first trip to Africa was actually as a research assistant on a primate research project, a long-term primate research project. So primates, I guess, facilitated my first venture out into Africa.
Hearing Natasha's perspective on the role of zoos in conservation, I got thinking about whether animals raised in captivity could ever function in the wild in the same way as their non-captive bred counterparts.
Taking a captive raised animal and then transferring it or transplanting it into a wild habitat and just saying, like, off you go. I don't think you're going to have a very high survival rate with that, depending on the animal, but in a lot of zoo settings, using chimpanzees as an example, they do have innate behavioral drives, I guess. So, they could probably figure out how to find food, but knowing how to interact with other chimpanzees, knowing how to defend a territory, that probably would not end particularly well, given how territorial chimpanzees are. Having animals solely in their native habitats is always the goal, but it's not the way the world is right now. It's not realistic. So it is something that we're always working towards, but we're not quite there yet. And zoos have a really important role of engaging the public who might not have the privilege of being able to go out and see, I guess, these what we'd call exotic animals. They don't have the privilege of being able to go out and see them in their native environments. So being able to see them at the zoo, it serves to spark their curiosity, spark their wonderment, and in some cases urges them to get involved in conservation activities.
Earlier in this podcast series, we heard from Debbie Cox, one of the conservation trailblazers working in Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda in the early 1990s. Comparing the two experiences, it felt as though Natasha was speaking about a completely different country, and I wanted to know how the Rwanda of today differs to the Rwanda of Debbie's first visit more than 3 decades earlier.
Yes, Rwanda has a very sad story around the genocide in the early 90s, but what the country has done since then is absolutely incredible. It's now probably the safest It's definitely the cleanest. It wins awards. Kigali, the capital city, wins awards every year as being the cleanest city in Africa. So I didn't really have too many concerns about personal safety or carry-on implications from the genocide, because the country had come leaps and bounds and made huge strides in social reconciliation. Economically, it's considered one of the darlings of Africa. When you look at some of the key metrics by which the big aid agencies measure development, Rwanda ticks a huge number of boxes. So when you look at proportion of people that have been lifted out of poverty, the number of women that are employed, the number of women that hold positions in parliament, education rates, universal access to education and healthcare, across the board, they have done and are doing amazing things. It's not to say that there aren't still a lot of problems. It is still a very poor country. There are still a lot of people that are in far from ideal socioeconomic situations, but broadly, the country has made huge strides and continues to do so. The biggest reservation I had was actually the topology of the the landscape. Rwanda translated is land of a thousand hills, and that is no exaggeration at all. So the field site that I did all of my PhD data collection in is Afro-Montane. So it is a challenge, and chimpanzees have very, very little body fat. They're all basically muscle. So for them, it's it's absolutely nothing to just traverse, like in one day, 20 to 30 kilometers of this landscape. But for me, who is not at the fitness level of a chimpanzee, it was pretty daunting going in, and it took me a while to physically acclimate to the conditions. But I did get there, and I got all my data. But yeah, that was the big scary concern that I had more than anything else at the start of it.
Now that we had become comfortable in the conversation, it was time to ask that one question that no PhD candidate wants to be asked. Tell me about your PhD thesis.
Okay, so my thesis, or my topic, is habitat fragmentation and the gut microbiome of eastern chimpanzees in Rwanda. So to kind of break that down for the non-sciencey folk, habitat fragmentation, the first part of it, that is a specific type of habitat disturbance or habitat. It's kind of a mixture between habitat loss and habitat degradation. So a habitat fragment is an isolated area of habitat that's been disconnected from a habitat that it was once connected to. So you can kind of think of it like an island of habitat that remains. In my PhD and looking at chimpanzees, the habitat is an Afro-montane forest, but broadly, habitat fragmentation could be anything. It could be a savanna, it could be a woodland, it could be anything really, but for my specific context, we're talking about forests. And then the next part is the gut microbiome. Most people should be somewhat aware with what a gut microbiome is these days. It's been a bit of a buzzword, I'd say, in the scientific literature and like pop science for the last 5 to 10 years. But my interest is on the chimpanzee gut microbiome. So looking at all of the different microorganisms that are inhabiting their gastrointestinal tract. And then the last part is eastern chimpanzees in Rwanda. So I focused my PhD research specifically on chimpanzees in Rwanda. The chimpanzees in Rwanda are part of the eastern chimpanzee subspecies. Chimpanzees are broken up into 4 subspecies across their range throughout Africa, and the subspecies that exists in Rwanda is the eastern chimpanzee. And why habitat fragmentation and gut microbiomes in Rwanda? Well, the reasoning behind that was the natural distribution or the remaining distribution of chimpanzees in Rwanda now. So chimpanzees in Rwanda live in 3 sites. We've got Nyungwe National Park, which is the largest site. It's about 1,016 square kilometers, and that's home to about 90% of the country's chimpanzees. And then we have 2 smaller isolated fragments. One of them is called Chamadongo Forest. So it is managed as part of Nyungwe National Park, but physically it's separated by about 11 kilometres to the kind of southwest of the continuous larger forest. And that small fragment is about 4 square kilometres and home to about 27 chimpanzees, I think, last count. And then there is a third site. It's called Gishwati National Park, or it's part of two separate bits of forest, the Gishwati Makura National Park, but the chimps only exist in the Gishwati section. So when we talk about it, I'll just say Gishwati for the simplicity. So that site, there are about 30 to 35 chimpanzees remaining in that fragment.
Interested to learn more about the scientific method and to better understand the research, I asked Natasha to delve a bit deeper.
So I would collect the feces, manually mix it up, so sort of smush it around in the bag, so that reduce the bias of the biological material being stuck to the outside, which is where, when I take the smaller subsample, that's primarily what you get. So you mush it all around, so you get parts of all the different parts of the poop, and then transfer a smaller sample into a vial of very high concentration ethanol. You can also get products like RNA later, but they are a bit more expensive. And being on a tight PhD budget, I just went with the simpler ethanol, which served its purposes for me. And it can stay in that ethanol for a couple of weeks, and then after being in the field for a few weeks, then I would take it to a lab, and then I would extract the DNA using a variety of different chemicals and a variety of different methodologies to break down the DNA and then extract it out from the fecal sample, and then I kept it on ice at the lab that I was using throughout my sampling collection period, and then shipped it back to Australia once I was done with my data collection in Rwanda, and did all the sequencing at my co-supervisor's lab at Curtin University in Western Australia.
With such an intriguing and important project, were any findings available?
Not quite yet. I'm still sort of refining my analyses and the interpretation of my results. So I'm just going to say, watch this space for now.
Earlier, Natasha talked about 4 different subspecies of chimpanzees, with her research focused on the eastern chimpanzees of Rwanda. I wanted to know what the differences between those chimpanzees are and whether the differences in subspecies is obvious to the casual observer.
You generally can't tell by looking at them, although anecdotally, you'll have people say that eastern chimpanzees are smaller than western chimpanzees, and eastern chimpanzees are hairier than western chimpanzees, and things like that. But generally, it's just determined through genetics, so looking at the genomes. I mean, they could all interbreed, and they do interbreed when they're kept in captivity together. So it all comes down to the genomes, and there have been debates over whether or not there are 3 or 5 subspecies of chimpanzee, but the general consensus now, and has been for a little while, is that there are 4. There are behavioural differences across the different subspecies, but there's so much behavioural and ecological variability across chimpanzees as a species that it's really hard to lump certain behavioral ecological traits or associate them with like one subspecies as opposed to the other. A chimpanzee isn't a chimpanzee isn't a chimpanzee. You can have a chimpanzee in one community when we're thinking about the different levels of social organization in chimpanzees. The lowest level is the party. So that's a group of chimpanzees that recognize each other as being part of the same community. So a party is going to be a subset of a broader community, and the community is the next level up from the party. So chimpanzees exhibit what we call fission fusion dynamics. So you'll have all members of a community that recognize each other as being one of us, because chimpanzees are pretty xenophobic. You're either us or you're them when it comes to the communities. But it's rare that you will actually see a whole chimpanzee community together at one time because of this fission fusion dynamic that they exhibit. So The fission is where they break apart into these smaller subgroups, and the reason that they go into subgroups are varied. Sometimes it's for mating, sometimes it's for grooming, sometimes it's for feeding, sometimes it's for boundary patrols by the males often, and the composition and the tenure within these subgroups is extremely fluid. So you might have, three chimpanzees that are hanging out together for a few hours, and then another one, you might find them and join the group, and then two of them might leave and join another subgroup, and then you might have a subgroup that is together for a couple of weeks at a time, and then they join a larger subgroup, and then when they come together, it's called fusioning. This is constantly happening on a variety of different time scales. So it could be hours, it could be days, it could be weeks. So you've got those subgroups, and then you've got the community, and then where you have a large enough habitat, you might have multiple communities in the same habitat, but they don't recognize each other as being from the same community. They are enemies essentially, and so the group of communities you'd consider a population. So where they're able to transfer between the different communities, and they can be considered as a one interbreeding population. So between those communities, neighboring communities in some cases in the same forest, they might exhibit some behavioral characteristics, whereas the neighboring community exhibits completely different behavioral characteristics. So it can be challenging to try and sort of attribute certain characteristics to a certain subspecies, because even at the community level, there's just so much variability.
Are you feeling inspired to take action after hearing about the challenges faced by chimps and their carers at Musée Vivant? Did you know that you can help? Find out how by visiting the Jane Goodall Institute in Australia's website, janegoodall.org.au. It was time now to change gear and hear about the work that project partners from around the world, including JGIA, are currently undertaking. That project is the Burundi to Gombe Wildlife Habitat Corridor.
The idea behind the Burundi to Tanzania corridor comes from the Jane Goodall Institute's broader Eastern chimpanzee conservation strategy. So we can talk about chimpanzees in Burundi and talk about chimpanzees in Tanzania, and then talk about where that overlap lies on that Venn diagram, and why they're so important to each other. So in Burundi, we can consider the chimpanzee populations as two distinct populations. We've got the chimpanzees in Kibera National Park in the north. So Kibera National Park is home to the largest interbreeding population of chimpanzees in the country. And that national park is actually contiguous with Nyungwe National Park, which is the forest where I did a lot of my data collection for my PhD. So it is the same forest. It just spans two countries. On one country, it's called Nyungwe in Rwanda, and in Burundi, they call it Kibera, but essentially the same landscape. We've got the northern Burundi population of chimpanzees, and then we've got the southern population of chimpanzees in Burundi. And that southern population consists of three isolated forest fragments that are home to chimpanzees of various size, and the fragments are of various size as well. Burundi is the second most densely populated country in continental Africa, third overall when you consider the islands, and Mauritius takes out number one. Rwanda is number two, and then you've got Burundi at number three. In between those two populations, you have a lot of people. Even though the distance isn't, by some standards, that far, Burundi's a small country. I think it's about equivalent to the size of Belgium. It's not a huge distance, but just the sheer number of people that live in between the two areas, it's not feasible to try and reconnect those isolated forest fragments in the south with Kibera in the north. for chimpanzees or for chimpanzee populations to be viable long term, the general consensus is that the minimum population size is 500. The chimpanzee populations in the southern part of Burundi, they don't get anywhere near that. Even collectively, we're only talking about 100 to 150 max. They're not habituated, so we don't have exact numbers, but based on censuses and estimates, we're looking at about 100 and 150 collectively. And those forests, like I said, they're fragments, so they're not connected at all. So we're not seeing very much, if any, a transfer between the communities. So from a genetic viability perspective, they're not viable on their own, or even if we were able to create corridors between each of the three forests, it's still not enough to ensure they have the sufficient level of genetic variability to be viable long term. So we have to look beyond Burundi and see what our other options are. And that's where Tanzania comes into the picture. Those southern populations are relatively close to the border of Burundi and Tanzania. And then going about 15 to 20 kilometers south of the border, you have Gombe National Park. Gombe National Park, as the die-hard Jane fans will know, is where Jane's origin story starts. Back in 1960, that's where Jane went out and started her long-term research, which goes on today, of the chimpanzees in Gombe National Park. The area between Gombe and those forests in the south of Burundi is nowhere near as densely populated as the area between the southern habitats and the northern habitats in Burundi. So reconnecting those southern habitats with Gombe National Park in Tanzania is actually the most viable option to ensure the long-term persistence of the chimpanzees in those southern habitats in Burundi. From the perspective of Gombe, it too, sadly, has become an isolated fragment for the most part. There are his bones of a corridor extending north from Gombe up towards the border with Burundi, but it's not as established as we'd like it to be, but the bones are there, and the work is ongoing to try and reforest that area as much as possible. That's kind of the start of the plan to reconnect those southern habitats with Gombe National Park.
While of course it is nice to think about habitat for wildlife and conservation of natural places, I was still a bit unsure about exactly what the burning platform, the reason for this project, is.
Without any new genetic material being introduced from females transferring in to the community upon sexual maturity. So it's the females that leave their natal group, the group that they were born into, when they reach sexual maturity, and they transfer into a new community. And when they transfer, they bring their genetic material with them. They then breed with the resident males, and then you get genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is important because it's protected against the threat of various diseases, and chimpanzees have shown to be quite susceptible to a range of zoonotic diseases, a lot of them introduced by humans. COVID, for example, not necessarily the COVID-19 strain. Thankfully, there haven't been any documented cases of COVID-19 in wild chimpanzee populations, but in the past, there have been documented cases of other COVID strains, and in some cases, they have been fatal. As humans encroach more and more on chimpanzee habitat, and they bring with them these zoonotic diseases that are transferable between species, it becomes more of a threat to them.
Natasha then went on to explain how genetic diversity is also important in protecting species against a host of other threats, including climate change, changes to resource availability, changes to temperature, and many others. Chimpanzees have a minimum required population size that ensures adequate genetic diversity to see prevention of disease, and also that the next generation becomes strong and healthy. A genetic bottleneck has major implications for future viability of the species. The northern population of chimpanzees in Burundi is already under threat from reduced genetic diversity. And as we are about to hear, other populations aren't too far behind.
For that northern population, Burundi, it's absolutely critical that they are managed as a continuous interbreeding population with the chimps that are in Nyungwe. For the southern population, even though the population size, when combined with the chimps in Gombe, which is about 100, that still doesn't get us to that magical 500 number. It's basically doubling the population size. So it's not ideal, but it's better.
Engaging with local community stakeholders is fundamental to the way that Dr. Jane Goodall herself and the Jane Goodall Institute's work. But this isn't always easy. There are often many challenges to navigate. Natasha explains how effective local community engagement affords positive outcomes for those communities, for wildlife, and for conservation more broadly.
The first principle is to listen. That they have many competing interests, and when most people are faced with the choice of clearing some forest to be able to feed their family, otherwise the family don't eat, they're going to choose to clear the forest. Across the board, the Jane Goodall Institute's approach is listening, and it's more about, instead of us coming in and telling them, you need to save your forests, and in order to do that, you need to do A, B, C, and D. It's us going in and saying, we see that there are problems. We see that you're experiencing some issues. What are your barriers to dealing with these issues? What are your challenges? What do you need in order to preserve your forests? In so many of the conversations that I've had with communities, they don't want to be destroying the forests. They have a really good understanding of ecology and knowing that the forests played a very important role in long-term persistence of humans, not just locally, but globally. But they just don't have the means and resources to be able to protect the forests to the extent that's required. So it's really about JGI coming in and listening to the communities and trying to give them the support that they need to address their problems and protect their forests.
We were reaching the end of our time together, and I had one last question. So far, we had talked about the Burundi to Gombe project and how that regional scale project would help to create wildlife habitat for the future. We had not yet talked about Musée Vivant, the zoo in Burundi that Jane Goodall Institute Australia has taken a particularly special interest in. We heard a little about Musée Vivant from Debbie Cox in episode 1, so I was excited to hear about that special project and the role that Musée Vivant will play in the future of chimpanzee conservation.
In a nutshell, Musée Vivant is a government-run zoo in Bujumbura in Burundi. They have a variety of different animals there, but our focus is on the chimpanzees. Musée Vivant is the first project that JGI Australia has taken the lead on. Up until establishing the project at Musée Vivant in 2021, JGI Australia had been a contributor or supporter to existing projects throughout Africa. So we support work with the Girls Empowerment Project in Uganda, various projects in Eastern DRC and Tanzania as well. But in 2021, we were approached by Debbie Cox. Debbie came to JGI Australia and asked if there was any way that we could help support some captive chimpanzees that were being housed at Musée Vivant that were in extremely poor and what I'd honestly say are deplorable conditions. Debbie had been providing support herself from her personal bank account to fund a caregiver that she had worked with many decades prior when she was based in Burundi at the chimpanzee halfway house that she calls it. So she was paying him as a specialist who understands how to care for captive chimpanzees to go in and feed the chimpanzees. So she was providing money for the food as well, but it wasn't sustainable for her. And the scale of intervention required was beyond her capacity. So she came to us and asked if we could do some fundraising. Having seen the situation, we said definitely, and it's grown from there. We initially started off as supporting the project as what we thought might have just been a once-off, but then there was so much interest and so much support from the community within Australia to provide funding for these chimpanzees and for the facility that it's grown into an actual longer term project that we are now continuing to run. When we first started supporting the chimpanzees, there were three. There was an adult male, Joy, an adult female Kita, and a juvenile female Flora. We started off by providing a salary for the caregiver, providing food for the 3 chimpanzees, and we also funded the construction of an additional indoor enclosure for Flora, the juvenile female, because she was being kept in a tiny 1 by 2 meter cage, which is completely unacceptable. That was the first phase, and since then we've built an additional 2 rooms, and we have transferred in another 3 chimpanzees that were being kept in captivity in private homes throughout Burundi. Now we are continuing to support the facility. We're in the final stages of signing a new agreement, so the project is slightly changing. Initially, we had engaged 3C, a Burundian NGO, to act as our implementing partner in Burundi, because the Jane Goodall Institute doesn't have an official office in Burundi. Whilst we undertake a variety of different projects in Burundi, we don't have official JGIA representation there. So we engaged 3C to act as our implementing partner to undertake the projects. 3C was working directly with the government and the facility up until end of last year. And then since then, we have decided to restructure the agreement, and we're bringing in the Burundian Office of Environmental Protection. Their acronym is OBPE. So we're going to have a joint partnership with JGIA Australia, 3C, and now OBPE to manage this. That's a really, really exciting development, and we're really excited to see how the project progresses and how it can continue to grow and the impact that we can have now that we're working in collaboration with both 3C and OBPE.
This podcast was produced by me, Dr. Paul Harvey. I want to extend a huge thanks to all of the guests and those people that have worked behind the scenes to make this podcast possible. Please share your feedback, questions or comments to paul@docpjharvey.com. You can find more of my work by visiting www.docpjharvey.com.